Okay, and now I'm going to introduce our speakers this evening. So my husband, Jonathan Wall, and I are both on the Northeast Regional Council for the National Parks Conservation Association, in addition to the work that the volunteer work we do with the Sierra Club. So we've known Timothy Leonard and Sergio Moncada for probably at least a couple of years now, working in that capacity. I know that the organization, NPCA, had done a lot of work with getting Stonewall National Monument established back in 2016. And in honor of Pride, we thought it would be a very good presentation to have them come and speak to us about not just about Stonewall, but also how the monument came to be. So Timothy is the program manager. They're both with the Northeast group of NPCA. They're both program managers and have worked with the. I know Timothy. I believe you've been there a bit longer than Sergio. I know we've known Sergio a couple of years, and Timothy, I think you've been there a bit longer. So I'll let you guys introduce yourselves as well and give a little more background. So thank you very much for doing this talk tonight, and I'll turn it over to you. Thank you.
Great. Thank you, John. And I'm going to share my screen right now. Here we go. Can anyone see the photo on the screen? Perfect. So it's a go. Tim, take it away.
All right. Well, hello, everyone, and thank you for joining us tonight. My name, as John said, is Timothy Leonard, and my pronouns are he and his. I'm going to let Sergio introduce themselves as well.
And hi, everyone. My name is Sergio, and my pronouns are he and they in English and él and ella in Spanish. And it's great to have you all here tonight.
And we encourage you, I don't know if you have chat box availability in this version of Zoom, but I would encourage you to tell us where you're from, where you're tuning in from, what city, town, township. We'd love to hear it. And we want to extend a great thanks to John and Jonathan for inviting us to be part of your session tonight. We're really thrilled to be here. So it's LGBTQ Pride Month, and we're here to talk about Stonewall, the history, the people, the myths, and how Stonewall has influenced all of us in our lives today. I will give you a glimpse tonight into the campaign that NPCA led to create this National Park Unit, the first LGBTQ National Park theme across the nation's 423 park sites. And we'll look at the current challenges that the park faces and the collaborations that NPCA has fostered around the park. So tonight we'll talk a little bit about the history of Stonewall. We'll talk about the role that NPCA played in the designation, and then we'll open it up for some question and answers afterwards. So Sergio and I work for National Parks Conservation Association, or NPCA. NPCA is a nonprofit organization that advocates on behalf of national parks in the United States. We were founded a little over 100 years ago by the same people that brought you the National Park Service. The National Park Service being the government agency in charge of protecting national parks throughout the country. The mission of the National Park Service is to preserve unimpaired the natural and cultural resources and values of the national park system for the enjoyment, education, and inspiration of this and future generations. And what that means is that they protect the special places that tell the stories of America, its landscapes and ecosystems, its diverse cultures, and its complex histories in places as different and as wide-ranging as you can see here, as Yellowstone National Park, the Statue of Liberty, the Grand Canyon, and of course, Stonewall, which we'll talk about today. The National Park Service was created 104 years ago. Today, it strives to tell the many stories that were not recognized or anticipated at the time of its founding. Those stories include the struggle for civil rights and social justice. And today, the National Park Service and NPCA strive to tell the stories of America that include all people, and that includes LGBTQ people. Now I'm gonna hand it over to Sergio to tell you more.
Perfect. And as part of that effort by the National Park Service to create a national system that reflects the entire American experience, under the Obama administration, there were a series of what the National Park Service calls theme studies. And one of those theme studies looked at properties that are now currently listed or are likely to be listed under something called the National Historic Landmark Register. And this is what you see on screen is the cover of the report that was produced in the last years of the Obama administration, in which we understand the Biden-Harris administration wants to follow up on. We'll get to this in a little bit when we talk about the campaign, but right now I want to talk about the history, the story behind the Stonewall National Monument. So what you see on screen is the Stonewall Inn, the facade of the Stonewall Inn, a half of what it was back in 1969. And there on the right, you see the plaque that was placed there by New York State in 2016 as it designated the site a historic site for state purposes. In that same year, that's when President Obama designated the site as a National Park Service. Here on this screen, you see Christopher Park, which is the centerpiece for the National Monument. The National Monument includes Christopher Park, the facade of the Stonewall Inn, and many of the nearby streets where protesters skirmished with police back in 1969. And now I want to play this video that President Obama recorded at the time of the designation, and that gives you a glimpse into the thinking that went behind it. So let's watch this.
Well, and Mitch and Joe Manchin and Kristen Sinema, sorry, I can't not fault them. And Christina, I think this is a great idea.
And can you please mute yourselves? Thank you.
Hi, everybody. The story of America is a story of progress. It's written by ordinary people who put their shoulders to the wheel of history to make sure that the promise of our founding applies not just to some of us, but to all of us. Farmers and blacksmiths who chose revolution over tyranny. Immigrants who crossed oceans and the Rio Grande. Women who reached for the ballot, and scientists who shot for the moon. The preachers and porters and seamstresses who guided us towards the mountaintop of freedom. Sometimes we can mark that progress in special places, hallowed ground where our history was written. Places like Independence Hall, Gettysburg, Seneca Falls, Kitty Hawk, and Cape Canaveral. Well, one of these special places is the Stonewall Inn. Back in 1969, as a turbulent decade was winding down, the Stonewall Inn was a popular gathering place for New York City's LGBT community. At the time, being gay, lesbian, bisexual, or transgender was considered obscene, illegal, even a mental illness. One night, police raided the bar and started arresting folks. Raids like these were nothing new, but this time the patrons had had enough. So they stood up and spoke out. The riots became protests. The protests became a movement. The movement ultimately became an integral part of America. Over the past 7 years, we've seen achievements that would have been unimaginable to the folks who, knowingly or not, started the modern LGBT movement at Stonewall. Today, all Americans are protected by a hate crimes law that includes sexual orientation and gender identity. Don't ask, don't tell is history. Insurance companies can no longer turn you away because of who you are. Transgender Americans are more visible than ever, helping to make our nation more inclusive and welcoming for all. And 1 year ago, this weekend, we lit the White House in every color, because in every state in America, you're now free to marry the person you love. There's still work to do. As we saw 2 weeks ago in Orlando, the LGBT community still faces real discrimination, real violence, real hate. So we can't rest. We got to keep pushing for equality and acceptance and tolerance. But the arc of our history is clear. It's an arc of progress. And a lot of that progress can be traced back to Stonewall. So this week, I'm designating the Stonewall National Monument as the newest addition to America's national park system. Stonewall will be our first national monument to tell the story of the struggle for LGBT rights. I believe our national park should reflect the full story of our country, the richness and diversity and uniquely American spirit that has always defined us, that we are stronger together, that out of many, we are one. That's what makes us the greatest nation on earth, and it's what we celebrate at Stonewall, for our generation and for all those who come after us.
Sorry, I think I accidentally moved the presentation. Here we go. All right, Tim,
All right.
your turn.
So we are going to start off by busting one of the major myths about Stonewall that's out there. And that is whether the Stonewall Uprising was in fact the start of the LGBTQ rights movement. And in fact, it wasn't the first time. It wasn't even the second or the third time that LGBTQ people fought back against police repression. In fact, the LGBTQ rights movement started way before the Stonewall Uprising. There were conflicts in California, in Pennsylvania, Washington, D.C., all across the country at places like Cooper Donuts, Compton's Cafeteria, and the Black Cat Tavern. These are just a few examples of pre-Stonewall events that we're not going to talk about today, but I definitely encourage you to Google them, look them up, and find out more information about them. There are plenty of others beyond that as well. There were also other forms of protest in addition to direct confrontations with the police. I want to tell you briefly about the Mattachine Society, which I'm sure a lot of you do know about already. The Mattachine Society was an organization that formed before Stonewall in 1950, and they advocated for LGBTQ equality and held demonstrations across the country that called for LGBTQ civil rights. They encouraged their demonstrators to blend in with the non-homosexual community, with the men wearing shirts and ties and women in skirts and dresses. And they were very effective at what they did. And we'll talk about them a little bit later on too. But for now, I'm going to turn it back over to Sergio to tell you why the LGBTQ population was protesting in the first place.
Thank you, Tim. So Tim mentioned that before the uprising, there were confrontations with police and organized protests. And here's a glimpse of what it was like to be an LGBTQ individual back in 1969. Sodomy's laws were on the books in 49 states. Illinois had decriminalized homosexuality only in 1962. So as a group, gay people together was practically criminal conspiracy. So amidst an atmosphere of fear and repression, gay bars were crucial to creating a sense of community and brewing political agitation. Kissing, dancing, or trying to find someone of the same sex to take home were all lumped under the designation of disorderly conduct. And bars could lose their license if they were caught playing host to such criminality. And sensing that there was an opportunity here, the mafia moved in and opened establishments that were members only, which allowed them to circumvent those requirements to have a liquor license. In fact, there was a law in New York State at the time that required people to be wearing 3 pieces of clothing that matched to their assigned sex at birth. And this law largely discriminated against transgender individuals and gender nonconforming folks. And I'm going to let Tim explain how this may have played out on the first night of the uprising. Tim.
Thanks, Sergio. So as you can imagine, the Stonewall Inn was bustling with what was at the time illegal activity. Gay people were drinking alcohol, they were dancing, they were showing affection to each other, they were dressed however they wanted to be dressed. And they were hanging out with people who were also gay. So, if you were an LGBTQ person at the time, and some of you may have been, the Stonewall Inn was like a dream. It was a safe haven. It was a place where you could be whoever you wanted to be. However, it was always at the risk of being raided by the police enforcing the discriminatory laws at the time. The police raided Stonewall and the other gay bars all the time. They'd show up, turn off the music, turn on the lights, confiscate all of the alcohol and raid the cash registers, and everyone was asked to present their IDs. They would take people, especially people who they suspected of cross-dressing or being trans, to the bathroom to see if they were following that 3-piece clothing rule that Sergio mentioned. They'd take the quote-unquote offenders off to jail. Looking back, it might be hard to imagine things like this happening because it was precisely so unfair. But at the time, it was just the way things were. And I'm going to hand it back to Sergio to tell you what the people were thinking in response to that. You're muted, Sergio.
Oh, thank you. So anger, frustration, and what New York Times called desperate courage were among the feelings behind the Stonewall Uprising. As I mentioned earlier, gay bars were among the few safe spaces where LGBTQ people could be themselves without fear and without hiding. So on June 28, 1969, during what was supposed to be a routine police raid, the customers of the Stonewall Inn said, "We've had enough." And what you see on the left is the only existing photograph of the first night of the uprising. And on the right is one of the few that exists that documented the second night. And here's what how one of the New York dailies covered the news the day after. How, who, or what started it, nobody knows for sure. The first night of the uprising wasn't anything planned. It was 100% spontaneous. No one really knows how it started, who started it. There were no mobile phones then to capture history as it happens. And in fact, there is no film footage at all of the 6 nights of the uprising, and only a small handful of photographs that actually exist. But what does exist in abundance are the many personal accounts that historians have tried to glue together to piece this part of the story. And how accurate those stories are, well, we don't really know. There's no way to tell. It's like that game called Telephone. But I'm going to let Tim explain some of the figures that are mentioned in recurring accounts of that first night of the uprising. Tim?
Yeah, so as Sergio was saying, without much in the way of documentation, there ended up being many different stories about how the Stonewall Uprising actually began. So one reason why there are so many stories is because at the time in Greenwich Village, there were so many prominent figures in the local LGBT community, which just kind of made sense that they would appear in various accounts of that first night of the uprising. So we're going to go through a couple of the most commonly shared stories here. The first one features Stormé DeLarverie, a Black butch lesbian jazz singer from Louisiana, known for her incredible drag performances. She called herself the guardian of lesbians in the village because every night she would patrol the neighborhood, making sure that every lesbian was safe. One telling of how the uprising began says that Stormé was being arrested for violating that 3-piece law that Sergio talked about earlier. And during her arrest, she yelled for the crowd to do something. And so they did, starting to fight back against the police. Another version of a story of how the uprising began says that known activist and Black trans woman Marsha P. Johnson threw a brick from a nearby construction site at a police officer, which then encouraged others to fight back on their own. Some say she threw a heel she was wearing. Some say she threw a shot glass from the bar. Others say Sylvia Rivera, another well-known trans activist at the time, who's pictured on the right in the black and white photo there, that she got so angry that she threw a cocktail at the police, and so others started to do the same. Many of these stories have actually been disproven. Marsha has said herself that she didn't arrive at Stonewall the first night until 2 a.m., long after the uprising had begun. And Sylvia Rivera referred to the cocktail she threw. She once famously clarified that I threw the second one, I didn't throw the first one. And though many people say they saw a butch lesbian being arrested that night, no one is exactly sure if it was Stormé or someone else. But none of this discounts the important contributions that these 3 figures made to the LGBTQ civil rights movement. They were active participants during all the nights of the uprising and during many important moments before and after Stonewall, along with countless other lesbians and trans women of color who led the way in the fight for equality. Historic events like Stonewall are often hard to trace back to one singular person or action. A movement is often formed by many voices, actors, and community members, and many people, like the activists we just talked about here, were involved in vitally important movements that are still raging today. Now I'm going to hand it back over to Sergio to tell you a little bit more about how that first night played out and how the rest of the uprising proceeded.
Thanks, Tim. So on the left, you see the boundaries of the national park as it stands today. The triangle in red in the middle is Christopher Park, and then across the street it's Stonewall Inn. And then you see all the streets that are owned by the city that are part of the national monument. and that played an important part in the uprising. On the first night of the uprising, hundreds of people joined in, not just bar patrons, but also folks from the neighborhood who were coming from all over the city as word spread. And there were also a lot of the protesters were actually the homeless youth that lived across the street in Christopher Park, and who they called the park in the neighborhood home. In fact, the park, even back then, was the heart of the community, and fighting for it was symbolic for a lot of these youth and for the rioters. And something that helped fuel the uprising was actually the knowledge that homeless youth had of the labyrinth-like street setup in that part of the West Village. So they were able to escape the police and circle back around the neighborhood to return to the fray. Today, the National Monument includes many streets and sidewalks around the bar and park for the very reason, as you can see on the map, because this is all throughout, this is where the uprising happened. Claiming or liberating of the streets for those who consider them home turf was part of the riots. So for the next 5 nights after that initial night, people showed up in front of the Stonewall Inn and at Christopher Park across the street to protest and demand for rights in society and before the law. The continuing protests after that initial night were both spontaneous and organized, as they wanted to keep the momentum going and make sure that it stayed big, and it worked. And at least on the second night of the uprising, there were upwards to 2,000 protesters in that region. And throughout the night, there were acts of aggression, there were acts of resistance. People threw pennies, bottles, beer cans, and even uprooted a parking meter. That's actually one of my favorite stories. But there were also acts of playful protest. There's, for example, the story that several protesters, including what today we may consider drag queens, formed a kick line and sang songs to taunt the police. Here on this slide, we see a message from the Mattachine Society urging folks to protest peacefully. And this probably reminds people of the famous Dr. Martin Luther King quote, "A riot is the language of the unheard." And what we see today in protest by the Black Lives Matter movement is nothing new. It's happened in recent American history when the grievances of a people go unheard. And in the case of Stonewall, the nation had simply failed to hear that life for LGBTQ people at the time had become unbearable. And Stormé, one of the figures that Tim referred to earlier, mentioned about the Stonewall uprising. She said, "It was a rebellion. It was an uprising. It was a civil rights disobedience. It was a no damn riot." So with that, I'm going to pass it on to Tim.
Thanks, Sergio. So with the 6-night uprising, the movement to secure civil rights for LGBTQ Americans had forever changed. As we mentioned earlier, there was activism that existed before Stonewall, like the Mattachine, but the size, visibility, and energy of the riots gave a lot more people the courage to stand up and believe, and the belief that they could make a difference in their own lives. In the year after Stonewall, many thousands of new activists started and joined organizations, such as many of the ones that are listed here. There's a couple of key ones we noticed that aren't here, like the GLF, the Gay Liberation Front, and a couple of others who were crucial in fighting for LGBTQ equality in the years following Stonewall. But all of these groups did activism in different ways. They held protests. They petitioned for changes to the law. They made the movement a lot more visible and powerful. And all of those different protests were important in the years that followed after the uprising. But back in 1970, just in the year after the riots, they wanted to make sure that Stonewall wasn't forgotten. And they wanted to make sure that their growing numbers and their insistence on gay rights were visible. So they organized the Christopher Street Liberation Day March, named after, of course, Christopher Street, the street that runs in front of the Stonewall Inn, the street that they liberated during the uprising. The march started near Stonewall and went up to the Sheep Meadow in Central Park. It started out pretty small at about 200 people. And as it moved northward, it kept attracting more and more people to join in off the streets, more LGBTQ folks, more allies. And so by the time it got up to Central Park, it was a huge march of several thousand people. Today, and that was, of course, the first Pride March that we celebrate at Pride every year. We commemorate at Pride every year. Today, Stonewall is still a functioning club and gay bar, although it no longer has to be secret or operate underground. It no longer is subject to constant police raids. People dance and hang out with their friends at Stonewall every weekend, though not during the time of COVID. Additionally, many LGBTQ New Yorkers and local folks choose to gather at Stonewall in times of celebration, like when marriage equality passed in New York State in 2015, and during times of mourning, like after the Pulse nightclub massacre in 2016. And even over the last year, as Black Lives Matter has taken off, protests have continued to gather in the street in front of the Stonewall Inn. The story and the location of Stonewall have become a symbol of triumph, a symbol of hope, and a symbol of a community united for a common cause, which is why our organization, NPCA, and other organizations work so hard to make this place recognized and have it designated as a part of the National Park Service. And with that, we're going to turn the conversation off from the history and talk to the more recent history about the road to making it an actual national monument. Sergio, I'll turn it back to you.
Thanks, Tim. So in order to start this conversation, we need to know a little bit of how national parks are made. So national parks are made, and this may be information you all know, but they can be made and they can be created in one of two ways, by a congressional bill or by a presidential proclamation. And oftentimes the presidential proclamation has been used more recently, given that it's trying to find consensus in current U.S. Congresses. But Tim, do you want to add? And just to let the audience know, this is part of the presentation that is less scripted. The initial part that you saw is something that we share with different audiences, and this is more of a dialogue, a discussion of how NPCA went about in putting together a campaign for Stonewall. So Tim, I'm going to let you add additional comments.
So National Parks Conservation Association has been at work for over 100 years and has worked on a number of new national park campaigns. And the way that usually starts is by having a group of public folks, an organization, or some sort of movement come to us and say, we would like our story told by the National Park Service. We'd like our history recognized. We think this is important. And they come to us because they know we've worked on these types of campaigns before. And that's exactly what happened with Stonewall National Monument. We had a number of different folks come to us and say, we want this history to be recognized. We want this history to be told. And we think the National Park Service, as the nation's storyteller, should be the one to do that. It really gives it that national level of significance and recognition. So like Sergio mentioned, there are two ways to create a national park unit. First, a congressional bill that he mentioned in Congress, and the second is a presidential proclamation. Just to be safe, we took both routes. We wanted to make sure that we were working all the avenues that we could. We had our partners in Congress introduce legislation that would move a designation for some kind of national park unit for Stonewall through the legislative body. And at the same time, we also worked with the executive offices of the White House and the Obama administration, specifically through the Department of the Interior, of course, where the National Park Service lives, to make a presidential proclamation happen for Stonewall. And most often a presidential proclamation in this case would be through the use of the Antiquities Act, which would create a national monument. So that ultimately is how we got the term Stonewall National Monument instead of Stonewall National Park or National Historic Site or some of the other titles that were being tossed around.
And so in order to demonstrate to the White House that there is support for a park, well, you do need to demonstrate a groundswell of support. And NPCA, I believe back in 2013 maybe 2013, 2014, started reaching out to elected officials, LGBTQ historians, LGBT organizations in the city, historic preservationists, and thousands of individuals as well. So over time, we garnered enough information to say there is enough support for a national park designation. It's the time to do it. And I have been with NPCA for only 2 years, but Tim's been around for, I believe, 5 or 6 years. And he has some of that institutional knowledge from the time that the park was being designated. And maybe, Tim, you can speak about the different listening sessions that we had throughout the country to ask the question, is NPCA the right organization to be doing this?
That's right. And as we do this, we can even scroll through some of the images that we have here. And I've been at NPCA for 8 years, not that anyone's counting. I'm counting a little bit, but this is a photo from one of the press conferences that we did in front of Stonewall with a number of decision makers during the designation campaign. And that's obviously Senator Kirsten Gillibrand from New York speaking. Congressman Nadler is all the way to the left there. And some of the other folks here, Congresswoman Maloney is there, and a couple of other New York City and New York State officials who are here. This was, as you can see, during the National Park for Stonewall campaign, which was a national campaign that we did. As Sergio mentioned, we went across the country because any of these national park sites, they're not just about the location where they exist. They have to be nationally significant, and they have to be a story that is going to resonate with all Americans and all types of people. So that was something that was really important to us. We can go to the next slide here. And this is an example of a listening session that we did. This is at PS 41 in Chelsea, in Manhattan. And this was a public meeting session that we did with the Secretary of the Interior at the time, Sally Jewell, and the Director of the National Park Service, John Jarvis. You can't see them, but they're behind the photographer on the stage. And everyone who came there registered to speak, and ideally speak in support of the designation of the site, or to raise questions to make sure that the site was designated and that the history was going to be interpreted in a respectful, accurate, and appropriate way. Certainly, we talked about how complicated the history was, and we'll talk about this again in a second. It was really important to everybody who was involved in this process that this site be done correctly, especially with it being the very first LGBTQ historic national park site. We wanted to make sure that it was sort of lived up to the expectations as best as it could. And this is another example from some of the outreach that we did, collecting the many, many thousands of signatures that we did from the public, from LGBTQ individuals and organizations in support of the park. This is some of the flyers that we did, again, before it was ever known as Stonewall National Monument. It was just some sort of national park for Stonewall. Let's see what's next.
And it's something that's important to highlight too, is the fact that at this point, Stonewall had percolated up in terms of different designations that had been given to the Stonewall Inn, the bar, starting with 1969, when it became part of the historic district that New York City designated as worthy of protection. And back in 1999, it was the first historical site in the United States that was LGBTQ themed to make it into the National Register of Historic Places, which, as the name indicates, lists thousands of properties that have value to the historical narrative of the entire nation. So the fact that Stonewall already had percolated up made it a perfect choice to move forward with a campaign. And with that, we're going to move it now on to something that John and Jonathan asked us to present on, which are the current challenges of this park unit. It's a very young park unit within the system, and also the current collaborations that NPCA has in place or is ready to put in place. So with that, current challenges. So first one off the list is a visitor center. If you've been there recently, you notice that there is the park, which is owned by the federal government. there are the nearby streets and sidewalks owned by the city, and then you have the privately owned Stonewall Inn Bar. But there, other than the park itself, there's no other way that visitors can interact with park rangers to learn about the story of this site. And the number of visitors as of 2018 was 530,000 per year. So that's a fantastic opportunity to tell a story about why this site is so important, not only within the US, but globally. So when I came on board at HPCA 2 years ago, one of my main tasks was to help us out in trying to secure a visitor center where visitors can meet the rangers, hear the stories, where the park rangers have a place to rest, where the park rangers can also change into their uniforms, when there may be public speaking engagements, or even maybe a short art exhibit that also connects to this wonderful story housed within the boundaries of the park. I'm going to let Tim explain the next 2 bullet points on this list.
Sure. So some of the other challenges that we're encountering with Stonewall National Monument, the first we mentioned a little bit earlier, is just LGBTQ history and interpretation and the lack of it over history. LGBTQ history isn't told in the school textbooks. It hasn't been recorded, like we talked about, hasn't been photographed and filmed nearly to the extent that other histories have been. And so a lot of the stories that we're trying to tell at the monument and that the Park Service is trying to tell, it really requires an extra level of investigation, of digging, of really trying to find out what the actual stories are, what the history looks like. And that can be very complicated, it can be very controversial, and that work still is occurring today to try to iron out those narratives. At the same time, stories like from the Stonewall Uprising, a lot of participants who were there have either passed on or they are passing very soon. And so trying to collect those histories and those stories is just a race against time right now. The other reality that we also want to acknowledge here is the AIDS crisis. And that was something that really just affected a whole generation of gay men and affected the LGBT community as a whole. That big chunk of history is just an incredible loss of memory and recollection as we try to piece together some of these stories. The next challenge that we have here with the monument is the fact that any political decision, it's subject to political whims. So to illustrate this, and it is an example, during the last administration, there was an issue where at Stonewall National Monument, there's a flagpole on that street triangle where Christopher Park is. And the National Park Service flag was on that flagpole, and the National Park Service put up a rainbow flag. It was heralded as the first rainbow flag that was above a national park site. And at the time, the Trump administration was undergoing a review of all of these different national monuments that the Obama administration had designated. And we very much didn't want to make Stonewall National Monument a target for the administration, either to have them come in and slash its funding, reduce its programming, or maybe even to remove the designation from the park site, which we didn't know if that was legally possible, but we didn't want to even risk it. So and there was a lot of blowback against that rainbow flag over the national monument. So what we ended up doing was very quickly redefining the boundary of the national monument. Sorry, there's a lot of traffic outside. And making sure that that sidewalk that encircles the Christopher Park fence was reverted back to New York City parkland, in which case that flagpole was now not in the national monument itself, but was in city parkland, and they were able to switch back the flag to New York City parkland, City Parks Department flag, keep the rainbow flag up there, and continue on their way. So it was a very quick sort of political decision to make sure that the rainbow flag stayed at the national monument, though not on actual federal land. Another challenge that we're continuing to face. I'll turn it over to Sergio to talk about some more current issues as well.
And as I mentioned, Stonewall as a park will be on June 24th, 5 years old. That is really young for a national park. We have national parks that are more than 100 years old. So because it's still a young park, there are still many planning documents that have not been drafted or published yet. And a key one of those planning documents is called the Visitor Experience Plan, and that was scheduled to be drafted and published last year, but the pandemic has put a different timeline on that now. So, it's still a very young park, many moving parts that have yet to be defined. And lastly, I'm going to let Tim explain the challenge around creating a friends group for the park.
Yeah, just very briefly, this is very similar to the issue with the visitor center. As we know, a lot of institutions, museums, parks, gardens have friends groups, that these informal groups that sometimes are pretty formal, that help support an institution through fundraising, through coordinating volunteers, through holding special events, doing all of this other work to help support those institutions. A lot of national parks also have friends groups to do many of those same roles. Stonewall National Monument doesn't have one yet, and it's suffering because of it. It's something that NPCA has filled the gap in a lot of ways, which with some of our programming that Sergio is going to talk about in a minute. But right now, there is no friends group for Stonewall National Monument that would otherwise be able to coordinate volunteers, would be able to help fundraise, would be able to accept donations who are made to the national park. A whole host of different items that a friends group would normally be responsible for. There isn't one there just yet. We're hoping to help create one over the next couple of years, but that's sort of one glaring omission that we have right now.
And before we conclude, I wanted to also highlight some of the opportunities that become collaborations and that are anchored at Stonewall National Monument. And the first one has to do with the fact that we've been working with partners, LGBTQ historians at NYC LGBT historic sites and at the Stonewall 50 Consortium, which is an umbrella group that houses arts, history, and design professionals, and that helps elevate and further draft the narrative behind Stonewall. So if you go to npca.org/Stonewall, you'll find links there that can take you to an LGBTQ historic sites self-guided tour, and also brochures that try to educate the public and students about the events of the uprising and the events around the first marches, LGBTQ marches in the US as well. NPS also has produced fantastic educator resources for elementary, middle, and high schools. But that's a fantastic resource that NPCA has been trying to promote. And with that, I'm going to hand it back to Tim to pitch some Pride Month programming that we're doing in collaboration with other partners.
Just a very quick plug, as Sergio mentioned, we do have 2 events coming up later this month. One is a week from today. It's a trivia night focusing on LGBTQ history and national parks. And we're going to be joined by a special guest, the drag performer Patty Gonia, who does combine work in the environmental conservation field with LGBTQ advocacy. And we're going to talk about the intersection of those 2 fields. So that's a trivia night next Wednesday. It's actually exactly a week from now. And we'll send a link to that registration if you'd like to join us. It's going to be fun and low key. And then after that, on June 17th, we're also going to be hosting a panel discussion with Patty Gonia and a couple of other LGBTQ outdoor organizations talking about the intersection of environmental conservation and LGBTQ advocacy as well. So just furthering that discussion and how it relates to national park advocacy. So we'll send more information about both of those events after this so you can join if you'd like, and we certainly encourage you to do.
Perfect. And before we go into Q&A, I just wanted to highlight a couple of additional collaborations that we're doing, and one that's relevant for you as New Jerseyans is the fact that we are now in the process of trying to forge partnerships with New Jersey school districts, given that last year is when the state started to implement an LGBTQ-friendly curriculum as a follow-up to the law that the New Jersey legislature passed the year before, if I'm not mistaken. And we hope that will mirror partnerships that we have currently in place with New York City Department of Education and with Brooklyn College. And I'm going to leave it at that. And I'm going to open up to questions. Unless you have something else to.
No, I just want to say, folks, if you'd like, feel free to unmute yourselves and ask your questions, or if you're not comfortable, feel free to place it in chat and I'll read them out for you. So whatever you prefer.
I have a question. Why did you pursue the monument status versus a park status?
Sure. So the monument status is actually what is resulting from an Antiquities Act designation. So just the way that Antiquities Act legislation is written, whenever the president makes a proclamation or sets aside property to be recognized under some sort of federal jurisdiction, it automatically becomes a national monument of some form. So anything that's been designated, like at the same time in 2016 up in Maine, they designated Katahdin Woods and Water as national monument, and because that was done through the Antiquities Act. So there really isn't much leeway in terms of the name of the actual site unless it's done through Congress. So Congress might choose a different title or a different language, and of course it could be national park, national seashore. There's maybe 40 or so different types of designations. It could be historic site, national memorial. But if you use the Antiquities Act through the executive office of the president, it's always going to be a national monument. That doesn't mean that might not change down the road. Lots of national monuments have changed either into national parks or have changed names over time. But again, through the Antiquities Act, which ultimately was how this park was created, it ended up as a national monument.
Thanks.
Just as follow up to that question, is there any effort at this point to get a congressional designation for the park unit as opposed to leaving it as a monument, which is, would it be any benefit to have it as a national historic site, for example, instead of a national monument?
That's actually a question that we ask a lot of our National Park Service friends as well, because there are a lot of park sites that do go through a name change. I think of sites like the Black Canyon of the Gunnison in Colorado went from a national monument to a national park. The Gateway Arch, as we know, is elevated to a national park. Indiana Sand Dunes was elevated more recently into a national park. There is not a great deal of additional benefits that come. There's no additional federal dollars, for example. The only thing that really comes is maybe a heightened level of visibility. And certainly there are a lot of folks, I consider myself included, who have a goal to visit all the national parks. And so when something is elevated to that level, it does add just a boost in tourism and economic activity for the gateway communities around that location. So there are other ancillary benefits, but for the park itself, I wouldn't say there are any real benefits that come from a name change, from a redesignation.
And to cite a specific New Jersey example too, in the past, there's been efforts to redesignate Delaware Water Gap National Recreation Area as Delaware Water Gap National Park, but those efforts have never gotten enough traction. So it's to secure that kind of change in designation is not an easy task too.
With the I understand that you need essentially office space and a presentation space, a visitor center. And now with rentals and some properties rather less devalued since the pandemic, is there more of an effort to try to secure a place? And the second question would be is the Pride Center on the path that is in the city that's part of the National Park Zone? And if it is, would the Pride Center be interested in some federal dollars to renovate it, maybe a portion of the building to put the center in there, the visitor center there?
Yeah, as far as I'm aware, the Pride Center is not under any consideration right now to be included within any sort of national park designation or boundary. And what's interesting is even with Stonewall National Monument, we looked at the map earlier and you saw that red triangle that was Christopher Park, and you saw all of the green boundary, which are the streets surrounding it. Only that red triangle is the part that's Christopher Park, is the part that's federally owned, that the National Park Service can spend the bulk of their money in. All of that green boundary is what I like to call the interpretive boundary. It's sort of that invisible boundary that the Park Service can use as they try to tell the story and lay out what's happened. But the Park Service, a lot of it might be privately owned or are places that are not actually under the Park Service's jurisdiction. So their funding really wouldn't be able to be applied there. But in terms of a visitor center, I'm going to turn it over to Sergio to tell you a little more about that.
Yeah, so that's something we've been working on for the past, I think, even before my time with NPCA, maybe 3-4 years. And I think maybe our efforts will be coming into fruition soon enough. You know, the negotiations have been advancing, and there's a good likelihood our partners will make an announcement. And again, you know, this is something that NPCA has played a key role in being the glue that brings together all these different stakeholders that want to see a visitor center so that they can talk to each other, collaborate, and avoid duplication of efforts, and so that everyone is managing the same information at the same time. Part of what we do around Stonewall National Monument is bringing these stakeholders together in what we call the Stonewall Court Stakeholders Group. And I think there was a second part to your question, Jonathan, that I'm totally blanking out on.
Well, the visitor center, I think we mentioned that. Yeah.
Oh yeah. So in another
yeah.
Twist to the visitor center too is that we have the Center for Architecture to offering their space for the National Park Service to as an auxiliary in terms of interpretive space, you know, to host lectures or to host exhibits as well.
Good.
And I know the LGBT Center in Manhattan had at one point also offered the space as well.
Thank you.
So yes, those conversations are ongoing, and we're just in the same line as you're thinking, Jonathan, trying to take advantage of the current situation to see if we might be able to gain some ground.
Have you thought about, or has someone proposed maybe a constellation of sites like the Gateway rec area has? It's 3 sites kind of separated. Could that be an option, or would you not get enough traction elsewhere in the city, especially if if you could find sites in other boroughs to tell the story?
Yeah, well, that's actually a really interesting question, and we have considered that. So if you do have a chance to look online, and maybe we'll find the link and post it to that self-guided walking tour brochure that we have of Stonewall National Monument, we do include a couple of other sites that are separate from the actual Stonewall area because they're so important to the history as well. We talk about sites up in Harlem. We talk about the piers along the river. We talk about the area around St. Vincent's Hospital in Manhattan. We talk about even like Reese Beach at Gateway, Gunnison Beach, all these other places that are really crucial to the LGBT community in the tri-state area. We have definitely talked about a satellite sort of system similar to Gateway, similar even to like Harriet Tubman's site, which has a site in Maryland and a site in Auburn, New York. So that's definitely, I think, maybe in the running. But right now, the site is so new that we haven't quite gotten there yet. We want to make sure we have our central visitor center and everything up and running, and then maybe talk about maybe expanding to different satellite parts. But it's definitely consideration. I mean, one of the things that we've recognized in this whole process is that LGBTQ history is so complex and so broad. There really isn't a way that just one site is going to be able to tell everything. And we're very realistic about the fact that Stonewall is not the end all be all of LGBTQ history. It's just one story. It's an important one, and certainly I think one that we felt was important to tell through a Park Service site. But there's a potential for so many more new sites and so many more stories that can be recognized by the Park Service that are all under this same LGBTQ umbrella.
Any more questions?
Okay, so just for clarification, you have the Stonewall National Monument, but also you have the park on Christopher Street Park that's owned by the government, the federal government. Are they
Yeah.
one and the same, or?
They're one and the same now, yep. So
Mhm.
Christopher Park was transferred from a New York City Parks Department park to federal ownership, which was then designated as Stonewall National Monument. So yeah, it's all the same piece of land.
But in your triangle kind of shape, you showed the park, and then you showed in the red, and then you had the green boundary, and that's where actually the Stonewall location is, but it's still one thing.
Yeah, so the boundary of the park is very porous and very fluid. So the actual red part is the only part that's federally owned. And in order to create a national park site, you do have to have a federally owned footprint. So we needed some piece of land in the area near the Stonewall Bar that was federally owned that could be designated as a federal park, as a national park. And so that's where Christopher Park came in. That became the piece of land that was transferred to the federal government. But meanwhile, everything else that's around there is still either privately owned or is run by the New York City Department of Transportation, all those streets and sidewalks, or even the sidewalk right around Christopher Park, which is still maintained by the New York City Parks Department. For instance, the New York City Parks Department still comes and collects the trash a few times a week. It didn't make sense to have the Park Service come all the way into Manhattan just to do that. So it's a lot of layers upon layers in a very small space. The whole thing is maybe 7.7 acres in total. But you're right, there's a lot of overlapping, and it's very closely maintained and sort of identified where those boundaries are.
Right, and you add to that mix the fact that the building that the Stonewall Inn occupies today is privately owned, and so is the building to the right of it, which back in 1969 was also part of the Stonewall Inn. So the Stonewall Inn you see now is only half of what it used to be 52 years ago. And both buildings are privately owned, so the federal government doesn't have a say in how to preserve them, except that to provide technical assistance when technical assistance is needed to preserve the historical value of the building.
So it's really the Christopher Street Park is really what the federal government owns, and that's what really is the key to this. So why wasn't it named the Christopher Street Monument? What happens if the Stonewall gets sold, is my point.
Yeah, I think one of the things that's really important is that that space and those streets are as important to the movement as the building is. I mean, that's where the uprising took place, was outside of the bar, in front of the bar. And one of the things that we also recognized during the designation process in working with local community members was that this area of Greenwich Village has a long history before Stonewall. And we wanted to recognize Christopher Park as a highly valued community park for that neighborhood for going on decades and decades. And we wanted to make sure that when this monument came in, that we didn't disrupt that. Every little piece of open space in Manhattan is so highly treasured and prized, is a nice way of putting it. Fiercely followed is the way of putting it. That we wanted to make sure we recognize this is only one part of the history that's occurred in that area. This is just one story. So we didn't want to change the whole name, but we also wanted to recognize that the story that was being told through this designation was the story of Stonewall. And so that's how they ended up keeping that name. But that's a good question, because even during the designation process, like we mentioned, we didn't know if it was going to be called National Park or Historic Site. We didn't know if Stonewall was going to be used. Like the site that's up at Seneca Falls is called Women's Rights National Historical Park. It's not called Seneca Falls National Historic Site or National Historical Park, even though that's where it is. And that's what we collectively know it as, Seneca Falls. But that's not part of the official name. So we could have easily just as gotten in Stonewall, LGBTQ Rights National Historical Park or National Monument. So it really could have gone either way, and ultimately they stuck with Stonewall.
Well, in light of Tulsa, Oklahoma, and what's going on there 100 years ago, which has been in the news for at least the last 6 months or so, it's kind of good to get it out there. So well done.
Great.
And there were two questions that we can answer before we end this session. Bill asked about who maintains the sculpture, Gate Liberation sculpture. I believe that is in the hands of Christopher Park Alliance, which is the entity that cares for the grounds of Christopher Park. And because Stonewall National Monument is such a tiny park, it relies, it's but within the national park system is called a partnership park, which means that it relies heavily on the partnerships that it builds to maintain the grounds of the park. So they have, the National Park Service has a partnership with the Christopher Park Alliance to maintain the grounds of the park on behalf of the National Park Service. And I believe that also includes the George Segal sculpture. And lastly, the question about can a designation as a national monument be reversed by the next administration? Yes, there is a risk, but I don't think it's been tried recently. And attempts in other parts of the country had been linked to not totally reverse the designation, but to minimize the amount of area that is protected by such a designation. That's the case with out west, Tim, New Mexico.
Escalante.
Bears
Yeah,
ears.
Escalante and Bears
Right.
Ears. Yeah, that's exactly where it occurred. And this was a question that we had, of course, during the Trump administration, was there were other national monuments that the Obama administration had designated that were under threat by the Trump administration. They were revisiting them. And there's even now worries that the Antiquity Act use has gone sort of beyond its intended scope. So today, what we have found, we have our legal department and we have a number of pro bono attorneys who work with us on some of these issues. They did a deep dive to see how easily this could happen, whether it's legally feasible. And they said that it's very, very unlikely and very hard to have happen. It's never been done before. There have been parks that have been removed from the National Park Service, but there hasn't one that's been de-designated through the Antiquities Act. So that's something that I think we're still want to make sure is the case, but we don't believe there's any, like Sergio said, any immediate danger of that happening, and certainly not without any major legal challenges to it.
Well,
We have one other very long comment. Let's see, who's that from? It's just Sergio, are you reading that? So
Which question is it?
the most recent question before the thank you. Next to last
no.
question.
You might be the only one who can see that one. Is
Okay,
that
let's see.
Oh yeah, you mean the one about the sculpture? I think I answered
Okay, so-
that. And if I,
Oh wait, I'm sorry.
yeah, if I
Yeah,
didn't,
right.
please,
Okay, very
yeah, let me know.
Okay, very good. Okay. You did answer that.
Thank you,
Okay.
everyone.
well, Timothy and Sergio, thank you very much for the thoughtful presentation. It's very exciting that you folks were kind enough to spend this time and prepare such a nice presentation. And we're looking forward to sending the recorded version out to a number of people who did ask to come and see it tonight but couldn't. And we hope that everybody here who hasn't canceled and dropped off yet, that keep in mind that there's plenty of other Pride events that are coming along, and hopefully you'll be supporting this this holiday for us all. And looking forward also, Tim and Sergio, for that that list of events that you folks had posted earlier, that you could send this out and we'll forward it on as well.
absolutely?
Okay.
Thank you all. Happy Pride.
Thank you. Happy Pride.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.